Hey, Sara Henning, thank you so much for joining me on Walking Inside Poems.
Thank you for having me, John. I'm so excited to chat with you.
And you chose Ellen Bass, and we're going to look at a poem from this book of hers, The Human Line, which I'm really glad that you brought me back to Ellen Bass. She's just such a wonderful poet, and I definitely want to talk about her, and we'll read that poem a few times. But before we get into Ellen Bass, let's talk about Sara Henning. Can you give us a little potted biography for our listeners? Tell us who you are.
You bet. Sorry, I was swallowing a mint.
I don't
um, I'm a professor at Marshall University. Um, Super excited to be here in the heart of Appalachia. Um, Yesterday, my latest book, Baby Burn, just turned one. She was the editor's selection through the Crab Orchard series, which I just love, and was so excited to be published again by my first book. Came out with them um, as part of the Crab Orchard series Open Competition Award. Was published in 2018. Unfortunately, my mother passed away from stage 4 cancer. And I ended up writing a book about my grief process, and that was called Terra Incognita, and was published with the Hollis Summers competition. And I got to have a book through an Appalachian press that I just love, Ohio University Press. I'm somebody who likes to write about family. I'm someone who values emotional honesty in our work, whether we're writing fiction or, creative nonfiction or memoir and poems. That's something that my beloved Allison Joseph has oftentimes said about my poems is that I write memoir and poems. And so that kind of it excites me to talk about Ellen Bass because I think as a poet, she embodies a lot of what I really value as a poet myself, which is that sort of radical emotional honesty.
Yeah, and I don't want to pigeonhole you as a poet of grief, but Terra Incognita definitely kind of placed you in that category. Is that fair?
It's absolutely fair.
I mean, this is life. This is life, and we all have our own. And I don't know. Would you say some of those poems you wrote primarily to help you get through the grief, or how conscious were you that this can help others?
Mm, that's a question that I was asking myself the whole time I was writing it. On the morning that Sarah Green called me and told me I'd won the Hollis Summers Prize, and we'd had a blackout in Texas. The grid was always going down, and I desperately wanted coffee, and I almost said no. I almost said no. Pick the and one of the other finalists because I didn't know if I could have something that felt really, really raw to me out there. Let me take a step back. My mother passed away in May of 2016, and as an only child, we grew up in incredible rural poverty. She was my everything. She was very much like Cheryl Strayed wrote in The Love of My Life, which was the precursor to her wonderful novel Wild. Her mother was the love of her life. And I think when you have that kind of relationship between mother and daughter, it can be really devastating when you suffer a loss, like I did and so early. Cheryl lost her mom when she was in her 20s. I lost my mom in my early 30s. And I was stunned stupid. I mean, I couldn't write, I couldn't think. I mean, I would teach my classes, I would come home, I was emotionally numb. And so when I finally started reading grief memoirs like Cheryl's and like Megan O'Rourke's A Long Goodbye, and eventually returned to poetry, reading Mark Doty really helped, his memoirs and his poems about Wally. I started writing, just writing everything. And I didn't know, I didn't know exactly what was writing. What I was writing, I told myself, I'm not going to write any poems about mom. No, that is verboten. And so the second you say that to yourself,
Of
that's all
course.
you can write about, right? So I was writing and writing, and I I kept thinking back. So I was like, these are poems that they may or may not, be published. I don't, know that so in that way, I don't think I was writing for necessarily an audience, which I think when you're a little earlier on in your career, sometimes you're writing with the hope of publication. If you're in academe, you're really trying to get those books so that you can, get the academic job, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I started thinking really intensely about the fact that it was really those texts that I mentioned and many others. Marie Howe's What the Living Do. I mean, I could give you a whole sort of what do you say, works cited page of texts that I read that really helped me return to myself. And I was thinking, Sara, how selfish are you if you're not willing to share those raw, unfettered, and emotionally honest poems? Like, you're a hypocrite. That's what I told myself. And so, when I look back and I think I almost told Sarah Green no. I mean,
Yeah.
I really do think I feel stupid, because then I would be, robbing the world, I think. And I don't say that sounds narcissistic as heck, but no, every time I've given a reading out of Terra Incognita, I've had somebody come up to me
Yes.
and say to me, Sara, when my mom died, or when my grandmom died, or, when an auntie died, it came out around right as the pandemic was open, kind of the world was opening after the pandemic, and people had suffered just insufferable loss. And, and to feel like I was able to give something to someone who was grieving in the way that those texts that I picked up after my mother died, what they gave to me, that's worth the whole process of putting
Yeah.
your heart out there. And I became a poet who is no longer scared to just put her heart out there.
Good for you. But I do understand it is a little strange. It's almost like you're trading on by selling books and getting some modicum of fame from this. It's almost like you're trading on this personal grief. But I think I'm glad you got over that, because I will tell you, I lost my dad when I was 29 and my mom 13 years later. And your poems and the poems of Ellen Bass and many others are still helping me to this day. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, that's made my whole week bright. My heart. Oh gosh. Thank you, John. I'm so grateful you told me that.
Now, you mentioned Texas, and I noticed the first poem. I'm in Texas. I don't know if you know that.
Mhm.
I recently retired from Texas A&M University, and the first poem in this, I had no idea that you were from Texas, and I see Galveston, Texas, first poem. What is your Texas connection? Did you grow up down here or what?
No, no, I grew up in North Georgia, right on the cusp of the South and Southern Appalachia. And right out of grad school, I got offered a job at Stephen F. Austin State in Nacogdoches. And so I spent 6 years down there. And there were so many things about Texas that I, grew to love. My students, especially there. They were, little bit sassy, you get that kind of Great Plains aspect, a little metropolitan. A lot of our students came from Houston and,
Yeah.
Dallas, Fort Worth, and just really just would go there in their writing. Like, they would just go there. And I was like, these kids are amazing. And they oftentimes didn't know that they were. So
Right.
I loved teaching down there.
Yeah. And Texas is such an odd place. We could talk about it for a long time. Let's not. Texas is, I mean, it's tough to live here sometimes because of the political climate for sure. But it's also beautiful. I mean, everything's here. Well, let's switch to Ellen Bass and get into this poem. Again, it comes from The Human Line, this book of
Mhm.
hers. Why don't we start? I've got a lot of thoughts about this, questions about this, and I know you do too. Why don't we start with me reading it? And then, if you will, at the end of this session, well, I'll ask you to read it again for us.
Absolutely.
If you knew, Ellen Bass, what if you knew you'd be the last to touch someone? If you were taking tickets, for example, at the theater, tearing them, giving back the ragged stubs, you might take care to touch that palm, brush your fingertips along the lifeline's crease. When a man pulls his wheeled suitcase too slowly through the airport, when the car in front of me doesn't signal, when the clerk at the pharmacy won't say thank you, I don't remember they're going to die. A friend told me she'd been with her aunt. They just had lunch, and the waiter, a young gay man with plum black eyes, joked as he served the coffee, kissed her aunt's powdered cheek when they left. Then they walked half a block, and her aunt dropped dead on the sidewalk. How close does the dragon's spume have to come? How wide does the crack in heaven have to split? What would people look like if we could see them as they are, soaked in honey, stung and swollen, reckless, pinned against time?
It gets me every single time. I've read
Every single time.
every single time.
Every single
Ooh.
time. Okay, my standard question, and I can speculate, but let me ask you, why did you choose this poem?
I think because it's a poem that, you know, every time I teach it, every time I read it, anytime I share it with a friend, there's just this incredible kind of universal humanness to that experience of so many of us, you know, numbing out to our day. We get up, we get in the car, you know, we get a cup of coffee, we do whatever it is we're doing, and it's so easy to get frustrated at that person in front of us in traffic, or, you know, that, like she says, for me, you know, having flown, you know, quite a bit, like a lot of us, you know, going a little bit slowly in the airport. I mean, you know, you're not mad at the person, you don't know the person, but you're
Right.
just irritated. And, you know, I think right now, in a, you know, in a sociocultural moment, that the idea of what is empathy, what is the role of empathy, how, you know, how much do we need empathy? And the answer is we need it 110% of it all the time, every single day. Her poem is unpretentious. It gives you tangible examples. It cuts right to the heart of the matter, and it really makes you just stop in your tracks and, you know, get out of whatever sort of, you know, laundry list of things you've got to do in the day, and think, my goodness, what if this pharmacist that I'm picking my pills up, and, you know, maybe I say a sharp word, like, what if that was the last word that that person ever got to hear, and I'm the person who was rude for no reason. I mean, it's a wake-up call, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little reminiscent of the Buddhist concept that when someone cuts you off in traffic or pisses you off because they have the benefit of reincarnation, to stop and say, that was once my mother. Or go back to the ancient Greek Stoics. You know, stop in those moments and say, imagine the worst. So if someone's being nasty to you at a restaurant or whatever, imagine that they have cancer. They just found out they have cancer, and
Yeah.
suddenly your mind shifts. Your mind shifts. One of the things I love about this is that she doesn't preach so much. I mean, in a way it is, but the way she says, when she lists these people, like the wheeled suitcase and the car in front and the pharmacy, she says, I don't remember.
Mhm.
She kind of owns up to the fact that, hey, you know, just like everyone else, I forget. Well, before we get into some of the lines in this wonderful poem, I do want to have a conversation about the very clear, straight ahead narrative nature of this. This is something that I've been troubling with in my own poetry, that I never worried about in my songwriting,
Yeah.
that I've had a lot of discussions with people about. I can imagine in a poetry workshop, someone saying to her, oh, this is, you know, tell the truth, but tell it slant. This is just too
Mm.
clear. You want to make this more interesting with some images.
Yeah.
Or as a friend of mine said, you know, you need to fuck that up a little bit so that it's a little more interesting. Uh, fuck that up with some provocative language. It's just too clear. It's too much like an essay, too narrative. What are your thoughts about that whether we get specifically into this poem or not, but about that kind of dichotomy or that issue.
You know, I think a lot of it comes back to being a creative writing, professor in the academy, I'm very, as many of us are, very aware of this notion of sort of like, I think there's like a cartoon out there somewhere about, this reads very much like a workshop poem, right? Where it's like the product of, whatever workshop you're in. When we think about craft-based strategies, and I mean, it took me a long time. I have an MFA. A lot of our friends have MFAs, of course. And, sort of what are you taught? What are the craft-based strategies? How do we take notes and, during the workshop process and kind of try to figure out what feedback versus what we want, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at poets who I think sometimes have been relegated to, oh, that's such a pretty simple poem, right? Like sometimes I hear it said of Mary Oliver.
Yes.
And I know that Maggie Smith.
William Stafford.
William Stafford. Maggie Smith took that on, about the what was said about Mary Oliver in one of her, I think her Substack at some point. But I'm the first person to call bullshit on it. I mean, if you really read Mary Oliver, and you really think about what poetry's purpose is, right? Oftentimes that public call to console, to, Auden's, we must love one another or die. I mean, there's nothing sexy about that line, right? Like when Mary Oliver asks in The Summer Day, what will you do with your one wild and precious life? Like, I don't need her to sex up the verbs. I don't need her to spin some, some metaphor right at the end. I mean, that poem, every time I read it, it makes me cry because it is so emotionally honest. And I think sometimes, and in my workshops, I always have my students, my big thing is, what do you want to write? What feels powerful to you? How can we help you get there? Rather than you need to change this verb or you need to change that image because of some preconceived notion. I think clarity is the best way to really say what it is you're trying to say, to tell the story.
Let me push back just a little bit because I more or less agree with you, but there's such a wonderful magic in the co-creation of poems. And I heard David White recently say, sometimes I'll be reading one of my poems that I've read for 20 years, and I'll read a line and go, oh, that's what it means. And so I think we do. It's not that we want to shroud the meaning in some way to be clever, but if it's just the meaning is too overt and too right there on the page, you sort of do want to say, well, why not just write an essay? Why is it, what do you think?
I mean, I think many of us who write and admire poetry, we know that, the genetic origins of poetry and song, we're always there. One got co-opted by the academy, one got co-opted by commercialism, but I, and of course I'm the big fan of Jason Isbell, Americana. I love those songs that, that don't use, what do you call that, auto tune and stuff like that. It's got that grit left. I do think that there's a difference between clarity and kind of writing sort of the cone or the seed of what you're trying to say. If I, for instance, if I had a student who wrote something, this is what I'm trying to say. Here's, a few stanzas this is, da 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 about my mother, da 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 da. I might say, well, if it's a song of mourning, how might you think about, the music, right? I teach a lot of meter. Is there a metaphor or a conceit that you could weave in that might help you think about the way, or might complicate the way that, that really that notion of what you're talking about is complicated. I think Ellen does that a little bit at the end with the dragon spew.
Absolutely. And by the way, I kind of felt the need to get back to her because I took us a little afield there. We could kind of debate and talk about this issue for a long time. And I think it's an important one, but let's get back to Ellen. And she certainly does at the end. I mean, the whole business with the honey and the stung and reckless. I mean, you want provocative. There's provocative. I think part of it is as someone who has been a writing coach myself and has written a lot, both with respect to songs and poems. So many people, when they try to write in this way, it just comes off as trite. And
Mm.
and sort of, I know that means a lot to you, perhaps, but let's make this more interesting. Let's make this more provocative. But in the hands of Ellen Bass or Mary Oliver, as you suggested, or William Stafford, we don't have that problem.
No,
Yeah,
no.
that's where I come down on this anyway.
And if you look at, and I couldn't help myself but bring just a couple of other Ellen poems with me to kind of like
Right.
back up some of my ideas. You take a poem like "The Thing Is," right, which came out a couple years, I'd say about 5 years before, if you knew. The thing is to love life, to love it even when you have no stomach for it, and everything you've held dear crumbles like burnt paper in your hands. And then later on, she says you have to hold it like a face between your palms, right? And say, yes, I will take you. I will love you again. I mean, it's very, it's very delineated, but it's also, there's a certain, it's just so darn direct. That's
Yeah.
what it is.
And the themes there are so profound. This idea of touching someone, of someone, we're all going to die. I mean, okay. Well, thank you for that little excursion there into Ars Poetica a little bit. But let's look at this poem. If you knew, what if you knew you'd be the last? Yeah, I like the idea of the taking tickets. I have to admit, it's it's a little strange to touch that palm. You would almost feel violated if you were getting a ticket and that person touched your palm. Did that trigger you at all?
I mean, I think about those, say you're riding, riding the metro at, the subway, I should say. Where's my brain? The subway in New York City, like I did this summer when I went to go look at the, Van Gogh and the MoMA. And people are touching you all the time because there's just,
Haptic.
there's
Yeah,
just lots of people everywhere.
yeah,
And I think for me, touch doesn't, I mean, it doesn't bother me.
yeah,
But I mean, I guess what if you really kind of think about it, touch, as a kind of intimacy,
yes,
sometimes if one is a churchgoer, oftentimes a pastor will hold a
yeah,
person's hand for a few minutes while they're talking, and there's
yeah.
something really meaningful about that kinesthetic thing. Um, I don't know. I don't know that it would bother me at the theater, to
Well,
touch.
I'm almost sorry I brought it up, but I will say that, I grew up in a family of huggers. I love to hug and touch, but we live in a time where people are very sensitive, and then we also just relatively recently went through COVID, where touching someone could kill them, or at
True.
least breathing on them. So we're in a different environment now, and it's sort of tragic and sort of weird.
It is.
Yeah,
It's tragic and weird. And I carry that. And the caveat of someone touches me at the theater, I'm going to pull out my hand sanitizer and immediately sanitize my
true.
hands.
It's true. And I'm a guy, especially as a professor, who often would do things like put my hand on someone's back, or grab them by the shoulders and talk to them. And I'm so reluctant to do that now. I'm afraid someone's going to immediately, go to a dean and say he had touched me inappropriately. So it's so sad, but touch is so important. And I'm glad that she started with that. I think if you knew someone was going to die, you might get over that and want to touch them in some way. Uh,
Exactly.
we already talked about that next stanza. These are good examples of this daily frustration that we have with people.
Yeah.
Um, and thank you, Ellen, for the reminder. Again, I referenced Buddhism, but it's probably maybe even more germane to think about Stoicism here.
Mhm.
Uh, 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 you're going to be bothered, by the fact that that car in front of you doesn't signal. Let's put that in perspective.
Yeah.
Let's put that in perspective.
Always. I mean, even if you're the most patient, actualized human being, and your flight's going to take off, and you were late, and you are bothered by the car in front of you. I mean, you just are, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Somehow I just remembered. Well, no, I don't want to go down that path. Okay, so let's see the next. What do you think about this next? Oh man, we really get to it with this next stanza.
Yeah.
Uh, there are a lot of there's a lot of lore out there that's similar to this.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and amen. Here's a guy who he not only does he touch her, he kissed her powdered cheek. Of course,
Mhm.
she's an elderly aunt, as we can imagine, so she was probably fine with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it takes the poem in a direction that doesn't just think about those tangible, like universal examples, but it's something that feels very common, right? Common frustration, and it actually tells the story of a friend, and it's anecdotal in a way where we're moved beyond maybe the call of our own expectations to sort of hear a very specific experience. I mean, I find it interesting. I know these days, in this day and age, one might say, well, at what point can we, tell another person's story? I suspect that Ellen had asked permission, no, knowing the kind of writer she is. But I loved that story was told, that, the last person to touch this auntie was someone kind, right? That there
Yeah.
was a kindness to that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's if I've never met Ellen, but I've seen her a lot on video, and and again, much like Mary Oliver, there's something so authentic about her that there's no question about this kind of thing at all, that it's coming from a place of authenticity. And then here we go with this last stanza. What do you think? The dragon's spume.
Yeah.
How close does it have to come?
I think it has to get right in your face. You know?
Sometimes.
Yeah,
And the crack in heaven, that's an interesting image there. How wide does the crack in heaven have to split?
that's right.
What do you want to say anything about that?
I mean, what does she do here? She gives us a series of these rhetorical questions. She provides this kind of a litany. I always sort of think about it as like a rolling sermon, right?
Mm,
Of life's sort of like burning questions. But what I love so much about it is she doesn't attempt to answer them.
right.
They're unanswerable,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, maybe we find our own answers as we age or as we
Yeah.
gain experience, but she doesn't dare say, and the answer is, which
Right.
I think would maybe, I don't know that it would ruin the poem, but it certainly wouldn't make it as, I don't know, I might not come back to it as much if I was like, okay, I'm going to tell you how to feel right now, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the moral of the story is, and
Mhm.
yet there's clearly a moral to the story here, but she sort of leaves it open for us to find our own way there. Uh,
Yeah.
Now, how about the soaked in honey,
Mm.
stung and
Mhm.
swollen? It is all I mean, it's a really provocative image, but what I get there is just vulnerability. The fact that we're all flawed, we're all in pain, we're all I mean, and pinned against time, we're all here for a short amount of time. This is all about human frailty and vulnerability and weakness. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's the thing that I think sometimes when we do get irritated at someone because we're, on our journey every day, I think sometimes it can be difficult to remember that, if I'm having a bad day, maybe the person that I'm frustrated at for driving slow is also having a bad day. And I
Yeah.
think, sometimes we forget that any feeling that we feel, someone else is feeling, right? There's nothing unique about the human condition. Now, there's something that's evocative about the way that we experience love, death, sex, childbirth, those consistent emotions and rites of passage that all of us go through and write about and continue to write about. It's how you're rendering that story. And I think what's so amazing about that idea of being soaked in honey and stung and swollen. She introduces a metaphor, right? She goes from that kind of, deep sort of universal clarity to here is a metaphor for what we are. Like if you peel off our skin, we are soaked in honey and the bees are coming for us.
Yeah. And pinned against time. What a
Mhm.
what a really fascinating way to say, we only live so long. We're pinned against time. We're absolutely pinned against it. I mean, I don't know what to say other than that. It's a beautiful poem for sure. Thank you again for bringing us to this poem. Now, I do want to switch. Time's getting up on us a little bit here, but I want to switch and talk about your poetry just a little bit. But
Sure.
before we leave this poem, and again, I want to return to it at the end and have you read it. Is there anything else you want to say about this poem?
I just something briefly, which is, I know we mentioned Mary Oliver, who I think can be this, the unfortunate scapegoat of simplicity, because she's not. There's nothing simple about her poems. I think that we've reached a time in our sociocultural development where there is this interest in sincerity. There's this there's almost this deep longing for sincerity. I see it in the work of Jeffrey Davis. I see it in the work of Dorian Lux. I see it in the work of, Dinez Smith and Jericho Brown, and Ada Limon, and all of these writers who are willing to perhaps, though they are crafted and skilled in all the things, write poems that do speak right to the vein of what's going on and do not need to do any of the, cartwheeling we maybe were encouraged to do during MFA programs. I think we've reached an age where we want that kind of, many of us want that kind of sincerity. And I do think it's cyclical because I feel like when I was going up through school, that sort of post-confessional, Louise Gluck, some of that was like, oh, that's, she's great, but oh, that's kind of
Yeah,
simple. How can we push? What can we do?
yeah,
But I think we're back there. I think we're back to that need for sincerity. So I just wanted to say that before we moved on.
great. I love that. Now, as I told you, I have an upcoming episode that is going to focus on one of your poems. So we'll talk about you. Uh, so let's just take a minute, though. I just while I have you, I asked you before we started recording this that I did want you to read one of your poems. That's one that I really like from this particular new book of yours. It's not too new now. Is it a couple years old? When did this come out? Oh,
So
it is.
she had her first birthday yesterday. So
Okay. Okay,
yeah.
so it's a year old.
Mhm.
Um, well, it's probably too soon for me to ask you what else you're working on, but
Ask
what
away, but
what are you working on now?
I'm writing a book of poetry about Vincent van Gogh because I've been fascinated with him since I was a little girl, and I love art. And I think in another world I would have been an art historian. So I'm doing some expressive work with his poems from his asylum year.
That's great, and there's so much there, not only with respect to his paintings, but his life was so interesting too, and the fact that he was so overlooked and ignored. Okay, do you mind reading the poem I asked you to read from your book, Burn, is Meditation at Panda Express. Now, is Panda Express, is this a Texas thing or is it nationwide? Do people know what Panda Express is?
I've seen it at enough airports to where I'm fairly
People
convinced
know.
that
Okay.
it's a national chain. For anyone who has not had Panda Express, you're probably not missing a whole lot. I would call it like, I don't know, fast cash, like slightly elevated fast food,
Yeah. Yeah.
American, washed down Chinese. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of, the Food That Built America, and orange chicken was sort of a dish that kind of came out of like that, the really nice restaurant sort of beginning to franchise and do something different. So, I mean, the orange chicken slaps. So, I mean, if that's something
Yeah.
that you're
I mean,
interested in, I've never
for
had
fast
it.
food, it can be pretty decent. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you.
Meditation at Panda Express. My rendezvous begins at Panda Express. slinking between slivers of cabbage, orange chicken's opulent flame bewitching my fork. Crab Rangoon is a star-shaped pleasure boat, princely, lady killer of salt. I'll slide through cheap red oyster pails. Night wishes for dim sum, this sorry effigy. I've learned to love nights in parking lots. Panda Express, its marquee at the drive-through exalting the stars. I want this bear-shaped oracle to shepherd me to ease the grief I now mistake for hunger. I focus on freeing my fork from its plastic, hold it up to the light. On nights like this, the sky is shattered blue. Please, my prayer to no one. X's, O's, X's. Saturday's husband, we used to split an orange Julius, suck until we could taste each other's salt. We'd summer in beachside condos, sip salt-rimmed margaritas. Now, I fake joy when you won't look at me. Aren't you glad I didn't say banana? I joke. Nights, you're no better than a ghost. I think I'll pick up Panda Express, I say. You nod. These days, I learn to please myself. My headlights rapture shadows. Please, I say, searching for my face in the salt-kissed streets. It is winter. I want my mother, her yes to everything. Drive-through cruising, forking through lines. Our night drives, she'd call them. Dying, I'd feed her orange slices between hits of morphine. Orange rind, orange Julius, orange you glad I didn't say, please, don't go. Now I do the leaving. Night is only darkness reimagined, salt where longing existed, scar-shaped fork. My rendezvous begins at Panda Express. Orange chicken, a better man's swagger of salt. I begin with please, ask for an extra fork. Tonight at Panda Express, I'll eat my heart.
So beautiful. Thank you so much. And I'm not going to ask you to explicate your own poem, but I do want to just ask a few things or make a few comments. I love the bewitching my fork, by the way. That's just such a nice thing. There's so much here I love. And the sky is shattered blue. Whew. And I love the little humor of the orange glad I didn't say. There's so much here, but let me just cut to one thing in particular I want to ask you about. And that's the last line, I'll eat my heart.
Yeah.
It's such a provocative phrase because it conjures both grief
Mm-hmm.
and pride.
Mm.
Eat your heart out,
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Well, I guess but that's saying telling other people to eat their heart out, but it's a really provocative phrase. Did you, without asking you to explain your own poem, just you will make a comment or two on those last four words. I'll eat my heart.
Sure. I mean, and I think something that does need to be said about, this poem is that, it uses the sestina form. And for folks who aren't familiar with sestinas, you've got a 39 line, poem, you've got six line stanzas with a particular permutation of ending words. And then you've got that little envoy, the little tail at the end, where you've got to find a way to use all 6 words. And
Yes.
so I found, interestingly, when my mother was dying and shortly after she died, I noticed that I was really drawn to writing in form. And
Okay.
so I would say a lot of what this poem kind of turned into was some of the delightful surprise of kind of being forced by that obstruction of, well, I better do something with orange, you know, I better do something with, you know, and
Salt.
salt, it
Yeah.
turns into exalt, pleasure,
Yep.
express. I mean, you know, you end up with
Right.
these words, you're like, I'm so tired of these words. What do I do with them? But
Right. Right.
I do think that those last few, the last line, the last few words that you mentioned, you know, and I know that we've chatted about this, but folks may otherwise not know. You know, I had gone through a, you know, like we all do, who've been married for a while, go through those little rough patches, and you know, and I think I was at that point where I just wanted my mom. I wanted to pick up the phone and call my mother. And you know, I think that it in that desire to do that, you know, that becomes this kind of larger meditation on Panda Express being kind of this escape from this maybe cold house, the marriage isn't going well. There's this desire to, you know, there's this desire to go somewhere, anywhere, even if it's a Panda Express parking lot. You know, maybe this desire to sort of fill that void with, you know, the comfort of orange chicken. I mean, it is pretty tasty, but I mean, you know, I think sometimes when we are feeling empty or we're feeling a sense of longing, you know, when we eat things or we drink things or we do things, whatever it is we're doing to kind of try to augment the feeling we have, which is always momentary and it never works. You know, there is that sense of eating one's heart. I'm going to eat my heart today because what am I going to do?
Beautiful. Sarah, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the episode about you. But if you will, take us out by reading one more. Let's return to Ellen Bass one more time and read If You Knew for us.
Absolutely. There would be nothing that would make me happier. It's such a gorgeous poem. I'm glad we had a chance to spend some time to talk about it today. If you knew. What if you knew you'd be the last to touch someone? If you were taking tickets, for example, at the theater, tearing them, giving back the ragged stubs, you might take care to touch that palm, brush your fingers along the lifeline's crease. When a man pulls his wheeled suitcase too slowly through the airport, when the car in front of me doesn't signal, when the clerk at the pharmacy won't say, thank you, I don't remember they're going to die. A friend told me she'd been with her aunt. They'd just had lunch and the waiter, a young gay man with plum black eyes, joked as he served the coffee, kissed her aunt's powdered cheek when they left. Then they walked half a block and her aunt dropped dead on the sidewalk. How close does the dragon's spume have to come? How wide does the crack in heaven have to split? What would people look like if we could see them as they are, soaked in honey, stung and swollen, reckless, pinned against time?
Ellen Bass. Sara Henning, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
It was a pleasure.
You take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.